Imagine waking at dawn to the sound of warning bells, knowing that beyond your walls, thousands of your former subjects are assembling with weapons and rage in their hearts, coming to tear down everything you've ever known. This was the reality for Marie Antoinette on August 10, 1792, as she stood in the Tuileries Palace, listening to the approaching thunder of revolution. In just a few hours, she would cease to be Queen of France. In 14 months, she would cease to exist at all. But the horror of what lay between those two moments remains one of the darkest chapters in the annals of human cruelty, a descent into degradation so complete that even her enemies would later struggle to justify what they had done. The woman who trembled behind those palace doors that morning was already a ghost of her former self. 3 years earlier, Marie Antoinette had embodied the splendor of French royalty, draped in silk and jewels, commanding the respect of an empire. But the revolution had been gnawing at the foundations of her world with relentless hunger, and her failed escape attempt of Varennes in June 1791 had shattered any remaining illusion of security. That desperate flight, caught and dragged back to Paris in humiliation, transformed public sentiment from resentment into something far more dangerous, a visceral hatred that would accept nothing less than her complete destruction. The pamphlets that flooded the streets gave her a new name, Madame Deficit, the Austrian woman who had supposedly bled France dry with her extravagance while children starved. Her foreign birth became proof of treachery in the minds of revolutionaries who saw conspiracies in every shadow. As the insurgents surged toward the palace that August morning, the royal Swiss guards stood ready to defend their king. But Louis XVI, paralyzed by indecision and perhaps some dim recognition that the age of monarchs was ending, refused to authorize force. Instead, he made a choice that sealed his family's fate. He led Marie Antoinette, their children, and their remaining attendants across the palace gardens toward the National Convention, seeking protection from the very revolutionaries who had sworn to end their reign. Behind them, the Tuileries fell to the mob within hours. The sounds of violence echoed across Paris as hundreds died in the chaos, including dozens of the king's loyal guards who were butchered where they stood. That same day, the monarchy was suspended. The royal family was marched under armed guard to the Temple, a medieval fortress that would become their prison. Marie Antoinette's transformation from queen to captive was now irreversible and absolute. The Temple was not designed for comfort. It was a monument to older, harsher times, and within its walls, the former queen found herself stripped of every privilege that had once defined her existence. Revolutionary authorities no longer used her title. In official documents, she became the widow Capet, a deliberate erasure of her identity even though her husband still lived. She would never again sleep in a palace. She would never again command servants or wear a crown. The revolutionaries had decided that humiliation would precede death, that the destruction of Marie Antoinette must be total, not just physical but symbolic, a public dismantling of everything the monarchy represented. But what happened next would push the boundaries of cruelty beyond anything the Queen could have imagined. On the night of August 2, 1793, after Louis XVI had already met the guillotine and left her truly widowed, municipal officials entered the Temple prison. Marie Antoinette was informed she was being transferred. She embraced her daughter, Madame Royale, without speaking, knowing that guards listened to every word, watching every gesture for signs of counter-revolutionary sentiment. That embrace would be their last. Before dawn, the former queen was escorted through the dark streets of Paris to the Conciergerie, the notorious prison on the Ile de la Cite that had earned a chilling nickname among those who passed through its gates. They called it the antechamber of the guillotine, and once you entered, you almost never left alive. The registry logged her arrival with cold bureaucratic precision. Widow Capet, stripped of name and title, reduced to a prisoner awaiting judgment. Her cell was located in the women's section, just above the River Seine, and it measured roughly 3 meters by 2, a stone box barely larger than a closet. The walls were damp with moisture that seeped up from the water below. The single narrow window offered almost no light. Eyewitnesses who saw the conditions later described cells infested with lice and rats, where the air itself seemed diseased. Marie Antoinette was initially given no bed and slept on straw that rotted beneath her. An official decree ordered continuous surveillance without interruption, and two gendarmes were posted inside her cell around the clock. They refused to turn away even when she changed clothes or attempted to maintain basic hygiene. Privacy, that fundamental human dignity, was deliberately denied to her. The physician who examined her in late September noted symptoms of severe uterine hemorrhaging, extreme weight loss, and exhaustion that suggested her body was collapsing under the strain, yet he was permitted only limited access and no meaningful treatment was provided. Observers began to report a shocking physical transformation. The woman who had once been called the most beautiful queen in Europe now appeared decades older than her 37 years. If you're finding this story as haunting as we are, please consider subscribing. We dive deep into history's darkest corners, bringing you the stories that textbooks often gloss over. Your support helps us continue uncovering these forgotten tragedies, and honestly, knowing you're here with us makes telling these difficult stories feel a little less lonely. Her hair, once the subject of elaborate styling and fashion across Europe, had turned completely white. Some attributed it to shock, others to illness, but whatever the cause, the change was so dramatic that even hardened revolutionaries who glimpsed her were momentarily unsettled. In a final act of defiance, Marie Antoinette attempted to smuggle a letter to her sister-in-law, Madame Elizabeth, still imprisoned in the Temple. The note, now preserved in the French National Archives, was intercepted before it could be delivered. In it, she wrote words that capture the absolute desolation of her final days. I have nothing left to hope for in this world, but the revolutionaries were not finished with her yet. Hope was not the only thing they intended to take. The true horror was still to come in a courtroom where justice would wear the mask of vengeance and where accusations so vile would be leveled against her that even some revolutionaries would question whether they had gone too far. The trial of Marie Antoinette began on the morning of October 14, 1793, in the main hall of the Conciergeries Tribunal. It would last barely 2 days, a mockery of justice that was predetermined from the moment she was led into that courtroom. The charges read against her were extensive: treason, conspiracy with foreign powers, orchestrating counter-revolutionary plots designed to restore the monarchy and crush the revolution. But there was one accusation that would echo through history as a symbol of how far revolutionary fervor had descended into madness and cruelty. She was accused of committing incest with her own son, the young Dauphin Louis Charles, a child barely 8 years old. This horrific claim was based on testimony extracted from the traumatized boy while he was imprisoned, likely through manipulation and coercion by revolutionary officials seeking any weapon they could use against his mother. The trial was overseen by Antoine Fouquet-Tinville, the public prosecutor, whose name would become synonymous with the terror's bloodiest excesses. The courtroom was packed, with spectators carefully selected to ensure the right response, surrounded by armed guards who made clear that this was not a place where dissent would be tolerated. Foreign diplomats who received accounts from observers noted that the atmosphere felt more like a theatrical performance than a legal proceeding. Marie Antoinette appeared before the tribunal wearing a simple black dress and white bonnet, her physical deterioration impossible to ignore. Journalists present remarked on her sunken eyes and extreme pallor, though they also noted that she maintained an upright posture, refusing to crumble entirely beneath the weight of their accusations. When questioned about her correspondence with Austria and other foreign powers, she denied involvement in military plots against France. Her responses were measured, careful, knowing that every word would be twisted if possible. But when the incest accusation was raised, something shifted in that courtroom. The official minutes record her response as devastatingly simple: "I appeal to all mothers." The courtroom reportedly fell into silence. Even among the revolutionaries who had come to watch her destruction, there was hesitation. This accusation was so monstrous, so transparently fabricated, that it threatened to expose the entire proceeding as the political execution it truly was. Some revolutionary leaders later admitted they found the charge distasteful, though few had the courage to object openly while the terror maintained its grip on Paris. The evidence presented against her was a patchwork of rumors, distorted interpretations of private letters, and documents seized during the invasion of the Tuileries. The so-called armoire de feu, a hidden safe discovered in the palace, was presented as proof of her secret dealings with enemies of the revolution, but many of the documents were ambiguous at best, and several had no clear connection to Marie Antoinette's direct actions. It didn't matter. The tribunal had not assembled to weigh evidence fairly. They had assembled to provide a veneer of legality to a decision already made. After 2 days of testimony, with virtually no opportunity for meaningful defense and no witnesses called on her behalf, the jury returned a unanimous verdict: death by guillotine. Marie Antoinette showed no visible reaction. Perhaps by that point, she had moved beyond fear into a kind of numb acceptance. The verdict was read aloud at 4 o'clock in the morning on October 16th. She was given only a few hours to prepare for what was coming. At 7 a.m. that same morning, guards entered her cell in the conciergerie. According to prison records and the account of Marie Groscholz, later known as Madame Tussaud, who was present in the prison, Marie Antoinette was allowed to change into a plain white chemise. Her hands were bound tightly behind her back, the rope cutting into her wrists. Unlike her husband Louis XVI, who had been granted the dignity of a closed carriage for his journey to the guillotine, she was placed in an open wooden cart, the same type used for common criminals. This was not accidental. Every detail of her execution was designed to humiliate, to demonstrate that royalty offered no protection, that the revolution had leveled all distinctions. The route from the conciergerie to the Place de la Révolution was deliberately slow. The procession passed through the heart of Paris, allowing thousands of spectators to line the streets and witness the fall of their former queen. Multiple observers documented her appearance during that final journey. Her white hair had been cut short by the executioner's assistant, as was customary before decapitation to ensure the blade would fall cleanly. Contemporary police reports described the escort as heavily armed, with mounted troops flanking the cart. Jacques Roux, a radical revolutionary who watched the procession, noted that Marie Antoinette remained silent throughout, her head held upright, her gaze fixed straight ahead. She did not plead or weep. She gave them nothing. The cart ride lasted over an hour, a slow parade of suffering through streets where she had once ridden in glory. The crowd's reaction was mixed. Some shouted insults and revolutionary slogans. Others watched in unsettling silence, perhaps uncomfortable with what they were witnessing, but too frightened to express dissent. At the scaffold, Henry Sanson, the executioner, helped her ascend the wooden steps. In his later testimony, he recorded a moment that has become one of history's most haunting details. As she climbed toward the guillotine, Marie Antoinette accidentally stepped on his foot. She immediately turned and spoke her final recorded words: "Pardon me, sir, I did not do it on purpose." Even in her last seconds of life, facing the blade that would sever her head from her body, she apologized for a minor transgression. The politeness drilled into her since childhood remained intact even as everything else had been stripped away. At 12:15 p.m., the blade of the guillotine fell. Official minutes note that the crowd erupted in shouts of "Vive la République," but numerous observers remarked on a strange momentary silence that preceded the cheers, as if even those who had called for her death felt a flicker of uncertainty about what they had just witnessed. Her body was placed in a common coffin and buried in an unmarked grave at the Cimetière à la Madeleine, along with hundreds of others executed during the terror. There was no ceremony, no recognition of who she had been. The revolutionaries wanted her erased from memory as thoroughly as she had been erased from life. It would not be until 1815, with the Bourbon Restoration, that her remains were exhumed and re-entered at the Basilica of Saint Denis, the traditional burial site of French royalty. By then, the revolution had devoured itself, and many of those who had orchestrated her death had followed her to the guillotine. The fall of Marie Antoinette was more than the death of a woman or even the death of a queen. It marked the violent destruction of an entire order built on divine right and inherited privilege, a system that had ruled Europe for centuries. Her trial and execution revealed how revolution can devour its symbols as swiftly and mercilessly as it creates them. But it also showed how easily justice can be corrupted by vengeance, how the oppressed can become oppressors when given power without restraint. In her final letter, written to Madame Elizabeth on the morning of her execution, Marie Antoinette wrote, "I forgive all my enemies." Whether her death represented justice for the people or the birth of a new tyranny born from rage remains one of history's most troubling questions. We want to hear from you. Comment below. Was Marie Antoinette's execution a necessary act of revolution, or did it cross into something darker, a warning of what happens when retribution replaces justice? Her story forces us to ask, when does the pursuit of equality become the practice of cruelty? History remembers her final words at the scaffold, an apology for stepping on the executioner's foot. In that small moment of grace, perhaps we glimpse the human being beneath the crown, neither saint nor villain, but a woman who suffered greatly and faced her death with dignity intact. And sometimes, that's the most haunting truth of all.